Good evening. My name is Basil Mahaney, and I'm representing the World Affairs Series, sponsored by the government of the student body. I want to thank you for coming out tonight to hear our speaker, Dr. Zogby. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, though, I want to encourage you to attend some upcoming World Affairs events, starting with tomorrow night. We've got Joy Olson and Vicki Gass from the Washington Office on Latin America speaking about shaping a new U.S. policy towards Latin America at 7 p.m. in the South Ballroom. On the 15th, in this room at 8 p.m., we have the 2007 Norman Borlaug Lecturer, Monty Jones. He is the Executive Secretary of the Forum for Agricultural Research in Africa, based out of Ghana, speaking on agricultural research and food security. On October 18th, we have John Perkins, who wrote recently about his work in his book called An Economic Hitman, and he will be speaking on geopolitics, human rights, and you. On the 30th of October at 8 p.m., also in this room, we will have Cynthia B. Lloyd, the Director of the Social Science Research in the Policy Research Division at the Populations Council, and she will be speaking on Growing Up Global. We would also like you to stick around tonight after the lecture to visit with Dr. Zogby if you have any other questions, if we are not able to address them either in the lecture or afterwards. Dr. Zogby is the founder and president of the Arab American Institute that has served the political and policy research arm of the Arab American community since 1985. For the past 3 decades, Dr. Zogby has been involved in a range of Arab American issues. He was the co-founder of the Palestine Human Rights Campaign, the Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee, and the Save Lebanon, a private nonprofit humanitarian relief organization. And following the signing of the Israeli-Palestinian Peace Accord in Washington, he served as co-president of Builders for Peace, a private sector committee to promote U.S. business investment in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Since 1992, Dr. Zogby has written a weekly column on U.S. politics, Washington Watch, for major newspapers of the Arab world. He is also the author of What Ethnic Americans Really Think and What Arabs Think, Values, Beliefs, and Concerns. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Zogby.
Thank you for coming, and I want to thank the folks here for inviting me to be with you tonight. I'm going to start off a little groggy because I've had this is my 6th talk in a couple days, and I'm not running for anything. And I even thought about it at one point because I was getting people, and I remember reading a paper about, one candidate talking to 30 people someplace and somebody talking to 20 people someplace, and I said, shoot, I'm doing a little better than that. Maybe I could do it, but it's too tiring, and I actually have a life. I mean, kids and grandkids and a wife, and so I'm going home. This is my last one. But thank you all very much for coming. And I'm here because it's Iowa, and you are the first in the nation. And I just want to tell you something that I don't know if anybody else is going to tell you this, but you represent us. You represent all of us. You are the first in the nation, and you and New Hampshire get to do what none of us can do. You get to do what George Bush said he did with Putin. I hope you do it better, which is you get to look them all in their eye and see their soul. You get to judge them up close and get to know them and talk to them and make judgments for the rest of us. You do winnow the field. And the responsibility, therefore, is enormous. And I've been coming here, actually, I was sort of coming up and somebody says, is this your first time here? And I said, no, actually, I think the first time here was in the 70s. And I've been coming because I think that you do it so well. And I think New Hampshire does it so well. And I'm not sucking up to you. I just think you've institutionalized the process and made it an industry that works. And because we're in a mess in the Middle East, I'm here to talk to you about what I think you can do to maybe help us get out. I started always this way. And I get tired of saying it because every time I say it, I have to add a couple of years to the way I say it. But in the last 34 years, since the end of Vietnam, since the end of Vietnam, and you could even go before Iraq started. Before Iraq. We've sent more money, we've sent more weapons, we've fought more wars, lost more lives, and have more issues and more interests at stake in the Middle East than anywhere in the world. Anywhere in the world. And yet, there are a number of factors that characterize, even with all of that sacrifice, all of that loss, all of that investment, all of those interests, putting all that aside, we never got it right. The mess we're in didn't just start with George Bush. It's older and deeper. Number one, it's a mess because we do not understand the area in which we are operating. And there's a certain tragedy in all of that because we've been doing business in the region. We've been sending our troops to the region. We've got allies in the region, but we don't understand it. And because we don't understand it, we've pursued policies that have been bad policies. Because if you don't understand something, when you try to shape your relationship to it, you don't know how to do it. And because the policies have been bad, we've dug a hole for ourselves. And as a result of the hole, we are less safe, our allies are less secure, and we are increasingly disliked in a region of the world where we need more friends and less enemies. And yet, even with all this, I dare say that if you do not do something to make a difference, we will go through this election, 2008, no better off than we have been in the last 30-something years. Which is to say the candidates won't talk about the issues of importance in the Middle East. Or they'll talk about Iraq and the way that the debate has sort of filtered out now, as the extremes in both parties shape the debate. It's we either got to get out and leave or stay the course and win. And I will argue with you as the night goes on that neither of those two options display any understanding of either what's at stake in Iraq, what we've done in Iraq, and what our responsibilities are. But I want to back up for a moment and talk about each of those four elements. The first being that we don't understand the region. And Lord, we do not understand the region or its people. The historical narrative that we've learned as a society is either skewed or a shell of what the reality of the Middle East is. I can speak about my generation, and I look around and I see some of you are from my generation. I remember when I was in grade school and in high school and we were studying social studies, which is usually the most that most of us get about history and culture of the world is in your social studies books in high school. The historical narrative that we studied was, I called it Stone Age Man to Ike. It was basically Western civilization. That's what it was, because it was the only civilization. And it was started with Stone Age Man, and it wasn't Stone Age Man in Africa, and it wasn't Stone Age Man in Asia. It was Stone Age Man in Europe. It was the caves that they'd found in France. And that's how it began. That's how our story began. And then it went to Greece, and it went to Rome, and all that stuff, and then you went up to, the Dark Ages, and then you went from Dark Ages to the Renaissance, and then you went from there to on, and you ended up with the nation states and America, and we were the pinnacle of it all. And the historical narrative was, at best, limited. When you talked about China, which always was in the book, because you had to throw China in because they had a wall that was really big. I mean, if you can see it from a satellite, you got to talk about it. So China was there because the Great Wall, and Marco Polo went there. I remember we did that too. And Africa was there, had to be there because we got slaves from there. But what was there before and what was there after, not relevant. The Aztecs and the Incas were there, but they were the ones that we ended up beating, so they got a little bit of mention. The Arabs were there. There was always a couple paragraphs, maybe no more than that, and there was always accompanied with a picture of a guy on a camel in the desert, because they had to do something about deserts and Bedouin. And interestingly enough, and for reasons I do not understand, the Lapps were in there. Now, I don't mean to insult anybody from Lapland if there's anybody here in the audience, but I remember wondering why was it that the Lapps got as much play as China and Africa and the Arabs, and it was because they had big reindeers, and I guess we needed to know where they all came from, but was it human history and civilization? Did it teach us anything about the interdependence and the relationship? I mean, I remember how baffled I was. I grew up in an Italian neighborhood, loved Italian food, ate at their homes, my friends' homes rather than my own, although Lebanese cuisine is great, but I just liked Italian food. I was traumatized when I learned that tomatoes and noodles were not indigenous to Italy. That actually the tomato had come from Mexico and the noodles had come from China. And I thought, shit, what those people eat before Marco Polo? What were they doing? They couldn't have pasta, so what were they doing? And even with my own people, the Lebanese, all that food stuff came from China. The Mongols, who we studied when we mentioned them at all, as the hordes that invaded and destroyed, actually were the greatest conveyors of civilization in human history. They brought, as they went, the cultures of the East to the West. But we didn't need to know it because it wasn't part of our narrative, and so we didn't study it. When we talked about the Middle East at all, the narrative began in 1948. Tiny Israel was created, and Arab nations amassed on their borders to destroy them. That was the story. I always say this. I say that when you study history, history exists like beauty in the mind of the beholder. We see it as we want to see it. And actually, we see it in two ways. We see it from where we started and how we stand in it. So, it was Dick Gregory, a comedian back in my era who's still alive and kicking and doing stuff, but he used to say the following. He used to say, when Columbus landed and he said, "I discovered America," the Indians said it wasn't lost. Because the meaning of history was where you stood in it and how you started it. If you started the story in 1948, it was tiny Israel got created and all the Arab armies massed. But if you started the history in 1919, you started in a different place. And if you stood in the shoes of the indigenous people who were getting screwed at that time, 1948 meant something different. I would remember as a kid, the cowboy Indian story, it was our story. It was like we were on the frontier trying to be free and create a country for ourselves so that all could be free. And these savages were in our way. And so we had to do what we had to do. Like trees, we cleared them from the frontier to make way for us. That was our perspective, our starting point. But if you read their history from their starting point, it was an entirely different narrative. Somehow to get the gist of it all, you had to put the two narratives together to understand the meaning of the Indian Wars. And so too, to understand the meaning of history in the Middle East, it couldn't be the white man narrative. It had to be the narrative of our side and their side put together to create a picture of what really happened. But that was too complicated for us, and so we didn't do it. And based on not doing it, we shaped policies that did not take into consideration the realities for people in that region. And I think that in some ways the two dominating issues for these many years has been supporting Israel and getting oil. And we always called it our oil. We want our oil back, or they're stopping the flow of our oil, or they're charging us too much for our oil. And over the last 70, 80 years since we have been involved in one way or another in the Middle East, the ways that we have shaped our policy, or the conditions on which we've shaped our policies, or the forces that determined our policy were things like the interest of the imperial powers. Britain and France wanted to carve up the region after World War I. Woodrow Wilson at first said no, and then the Congress, the Senate said, leave them alone. They went and did it, and we ended up supporting what they did. And so what they ended up doing after World War I was carving the Middle East and literally dismembering it. Creating nations out of whole cloth. Lines were drawn, people were stuck together in ways, my people are from Lebanon. France wanted it. It was their entrepot. It was going to be their place to dominate. They had an allied group. They put themselves in charge. And then they said, well, but it's not big enough. So they added a little bit in the north and a little bit in the east and a little bit in the south. And they made a complex mosaic of peoples with the people they wanted in charge of it all. And the British did the same thing in Palestine. And, well, they had land left over, and so they created Iraq and they created Syria and they created Jordan out of whole cloth and imposed regimes in every place they went. And people woke up one morning and found themselves Syrian or Lebanese or Jordanian or Palestinian or Iraqi or Kuwaiti. And this was all a construct of the British and French to carve and create spheres of influence for themselves in that region. And we are still today paying the price. In every battle we fight in that region, we are paying the price for that manipulation of the lives and destinies of people who had no control over their own history. In the Cold War, another factor was added, our rivalry with the Soviets. And so as national liberation movements were emerging, and they emerged in the Middle East as well, people saying, enough of colonialism, enough of imperial domination, we want our own rights, we want to control our own history. The Soviets supported those movements, and we supported our imperial allies, and came down historically, as Martin Luther King would say, on the wrong side of a world revolution. I often wonder what would have happened if America, true to its values, its own value of having fought for independence, had supported independence movements all over the world. What a different world and what a different relationship we would have with the world's peoples today. But we did not. And so we picked a side, and we ended up seeing every conflict, not just in the Middle East, but in Central America and Africa and Asia, through the prism of the Cold War. It was our side versus their side, good guys versus bad guys, good guys being our guys and the bad guys being their guys. And oftentimes the bad guys didn't want to be their guys, they just wanted to be free, but we were on the other side. And then later on, as we got into the 50s and 60s, domestic politics became a factor because a pro-Israel lobby began to emerge that was really quite powerful. And while there are some who say, whoa, it's not really powerful, it was powerful. It was not the sole factor, but at times it could be decisive. And a domestic component then entered into how we shaped our policy. And more recently, ideology and religion have come to play a role, with the Christian right emerging in a bizarre form of theology, feeling that somehow the Jews needed to be gathered and then ultimately converted, and the final battle had to occur when all of the world is destroyed or something like that, and Jesus comes back, and I'm a Christian, but I don't recognize that, sorry. And the ideology of neoconservatism, which is basically a secularized view of the religious right in America, has the same manichaeistic worldview of good versus evil and the necessity of confrontation and conflict and the ultimate triumph of good. Jesus doesn't come back, but George Bush does, or something. I'm not quite sure how to describe it. In any case, with all of these judgments that were made and all of these forces that shaped policy, in no way do you find the realities of the region or the interests or needs of its peoples. They were pawns in an imperial game. They were pawns in a game of domestic politics. They were pawns in the Cold War, and they were pawns in the ideological battles being fought in America. But because we lived and we operated in the region without knowing, we dug a hole for them and for ourselves. And then came 9/11. And when 9/11 came, we were shocked to our very core, as we ought to have been. I will never forget that day and never forget the weeks that followed, because it was sort of a unique event in our lives, because we didn't just watch a tragedy unfold, we lived it. It was a tragedy for every one of us. We watched the families and those who had lost their loved ones and saw them holding pictures in front of the cameras of those who were missing and hoping they'd come back, and you knew in your heart that they weren't. But there was hope. We had hope. The hope was dimmed. And finally it settled in of the irrevocable loss. And a loss of innocence and a loss of security in our country that we will spend a generation trying to recover. But out of that tragedy, which can never be excused and never be explained as anything other than an evil and cruel act of murder of innocence, out of that we began to ask some questions. Who are these people? What happened? How did it go so wrong? President Bush asked the question at one point. He said, why do they hate us? And Newsweek splashed it on the cover. And immediately forthcoming were the answers. Actually, the president had an answer in the same sentence as he asked it. He said, why do they hate us? And he said, because they hate our values. And my brother and I, who do polling, began to poll rather intensively in the region. And we found at the end of the day that they didn't really hate our values. In fact, the problem was deeper than that. They liked us. When we asked them how they felt about the American people, they liked us. How they felt about American freedom and democracy, they liked them. How did they like American movies? They liked them. And American television, they liked it. I don't know why sometimes, but they did. Although tonight Damages is on and I'm going to miss it. But I've got a TiVo, one of our great inventions. What was life like before TiVo? Do you ever listen to the radio and want a TiVo and you can't? You want to go back and hear that again and you missed it? It's like... And so all of the aspects or the ways that America manifested itself, they liked. But when we asked them about policy, that's where the negatives came. Now in polling, there's two kinds of numbers. There's the numbers that pull and the numbers that drag. When Bill Clinton, the Monica Lewinsky thing happened, all of his numbers went down. With George Bush, after 9/11, all of his numbers went up. In other words, the initial response of 9/11 that George Bush had, that speech he gave at Ground Zero, drove all of his numbers up. Asked people, how's America doing? Well. Are you better off than you were? Well. With Bill Clinton, after Monica Lewinsky, you said, are we on the right track, wrong track? How are we doing? Are you better off than you were 4 years ago? The numbers went down. Because people's sense of well-being changed with a single event. They lost confidence or they had confidence in the leader, and so the numbers pulled one way or pushed and dragged another way. And that's the case of our numbers in the Middle East. They like everything about us but our policy, and that drags everything else down. So the overall favorable rating of America in the region is in the single digits. But how do you explain that 60% like the American people and 70% like American education and 80% think our science and technology is great and 70% think America's freedom and democracy is a wonderful thing for the world, but only 7% in a certain country will like us? What does that mean? It means that ultimately it's how we treat them that ultimately drags the overall attitude of us down. We do focus groups after we do the polling. We ask people to sort of elaborate on their feelings. And one guy said something I'll never forget. He said, I went to school there. My kids go to school there. I do business there. I really like America. But he said, I don't think America likes me. I feel like a jilted lover. And so his overall favorable attitude toward America is low. People don't judge you at the end of the day by how you talk about yourself or even how you treat yourself. They judge you by how you treat them. But this does not mean, nor can it be construed in any way at all, to justify any criminal act of violence. But what it does begin to explain is that reservoir of dissatisfaction and anger with America that fuels and supports, or at least is passive, in the face of that evil. And if we don't understand that, we will relive these tragedies time and again. Because the base of support we need to isolate the evil ones who do criminal acts is evaporating because of our behavior in the rest of the region. because how we treat them is so important, and because we've treated them badly, and because before we treated them badly, the British and the French treated the region badly, and because that region has never controlled its own destiny. It has never controlled its destiny. Or I would say it hasn't controlled its destiny for the last century or more. That loss of control is what fuels extremism. And so what did the president do? Because he didn't understand or take into consideration the feelings or the reality of life in the region? How did he get us out of the hole? He invaded Iraq, which in fact only made the sense of loss of control even worse. And what was shocking to me was not just the lives lost and the quagmire we're in and the mess we've created out of that country, but it was the ignorance that led us into it and shaped the bad policy that got us into the hole we're in right now. You know, I debated these characters. I debated them in the Council on Foreign Relations. We had a working group that operated under the surface after the 9/11 tragedy, and they brought together a number of us to debate how we should respond. And people like Newt Gingrich and Richard Pearl and the rest of them were in that group. And from the first time we met, which is the 21st of September, something like that, of 2001, they were talking about invading Iraq. And some of us were saying back to them, why? I mean, what will that do? How does that solve the problem? And their response to it was, it will shock the region. It will make them wake up and show them that America cannot be taken for granted. It will, and they believed it. It will, after we decapitate the leader, it will cause a democracy to rise up. I debated them on television, I debated them in the council, and things that they said to me were as follows. 7 days, that's what it'll take. The fighting will take 7 days. Maybe 6 months tops we'll have to be there. 90,000 troops, that's what Wolfowitz was saying at the time, and that's what they were echoing. 90,000 troops is all we needed. Because basically we just had to get rid of the dictator and some of his people around him. And flowers in the street and people celebrating us and democracy blooming and spreading throughout the whole Middle East. As I look back at that period, say that the biggest lie they told wasn't about the weapons of mass destruction. It wasn't about 9/11 and the connection that they said Saddam had to it. The biggest lie they told was about what they didn't know about Iraq, what they made up about Iraq, their fantasy about Iraq, about democracy blooming and flowers in the street and all of that. Because they took our kids and sent them into a war without understanding the society and the social conditions and the history and the culture of the people they were going to war against. And I will never forget, as I watched those kids walking down the streets, 2 of whom were my nephews, and I thought, this is a horrific tragedy because they see themselves one way, but the Iraqi people see them as something else. And as the days went on, it became clearer to us how much we didn't know. We tried to take a resolution to the Democratic National Committee. I'm a member of the Democratic National Committee, and Jesse Jackson Jr., the congressman, and I submitted a resolution before the war started saying that the Democrats in Congress should oppose the war. And we said we should oppose the war because we said there were costs, consequences in terms of commitment that were not being spelled out. And how do you enter into a country when you don't know the history and culture of that country? We were ruled out of order and they didn't want to debate it. It was the politics of convenience. There were those who didn't know and who were deliberately misleading us. There were those who were ignorant, didn't care to know. And then there were those who simply acted out of the politics of convenience and said, this is going to be too controversial for me to oppose it right now, so Zogby and Jackson, keep your mouths shut, don't talk about it, we don't want to do it. And so we compounded the loss of control. We compounded the sense of frustration. We bred more extremism. And we've continued to make mistakes everywhere we've gone. I remember President Bush giving that speech, his Forward March of Freedom speech in Afghanistan, he said, and then it was sort of like Dean's Iowa speech. Remember? It was in Afghanistan and in Iraq and then in Lebanon and then he just didn't scream at the end in Palestine. But I screamed at the end because what I knew was that every place we went, instead of bringing freedom, we were bringing chaos. And what we were doing was creating more of a sense of powerlessness in the people that we were disenfranchising and in the resentment that we were creating. And so today Iraq is a mess and Afghanistan is a mess. I mean, that poor guy Karzai, who's actually a good person, he governs Kabul during the daylight hours. And the Taliban is back on. There are articles that you will read about people in villages wanting the Taliban back because it gave them order and security. You'll read in Iraq today stories that will, I mean, look, one of the things that frustrates me most about Iraq is that we warned in the beginning about consequences that no one would listen to. One of the things that I worried about early on, because I deal a lot with the Arab community here, and a significant portion of it, in Michigan in particular, are Chaldean Christians. It's an ancient Christian sect from Iraq, one of the oldest Christian communities in history. They go back to the 3rd century, and they were 1.2 million strong at the time of the invasion. And today there are 400,000 left. And they are living in fear and insecurity because their very existence as a Christian community is at risk. And it is our responsibility. We did it. We did it because we didn't understand what we were doing, not only to us, but what we were doing to them. And in Lebanon, a country where we were holding up as a model for democracy, Lebanon is divided right down the middle. It is red state, blue state, writ large. And instead of bringing people together, which would have been the natural thing to do, if we'd understood, we picked one side and we pitted them against the other side, and we attempted to engage the Lebanese in exactly what we said we were going to do in Afghanistan and Iraq, which was with us or against us. Victory until the other side is vanquished. And if you have the neoconservative view, which is that you never compromise with evil, you don't even talk to evil, you destroy evil, and God's on your side as you do it, you don't ever have to pursue diplomacy. Our concept of diplomacy today is we talk at people and tell them, here's what you're going to do. But diplomacy actually means something quite different. What it actually means is that you recognize that the world is of competing systems and of different ideologies and of different social structures. And so what you do with diplomacy is you attempt to create an architecture that bridges the divide and brings some resolution to these differences so we can coexist with them and maybe bridge over those differences to find resolution to problems. But if you don't do that, then you tell the government of Lebanon, you got to destroy Hezbollah. Then you tell the Palestinians, you got to destroy Hamas. Then you tell the Iraqis, you got to destroy who we tell you to destroy. And now we're telling the whole region, we got to destroy Iran. And instead of us emerging stronger, we've become weaker. Because what it has shown is that force and will, almost it's a Hegelian, but even in more recent times it took on an uglier form, but that notion that will and will alone, coupled with force, can ultimately be victorious is a nonsense argument in history. Because what it ignores is the reality of the other and the needs of the other and the fact that the other ultimately kicks back at you. So Lebanon is divided. The Israeli-Palestinian thing has gone nowhere at all. Palestinians could not be destroyed and defeated. And the Palestinian divide is now real, and we want one side to defeat the other, and the result is that we now have a permanently divided Palestine, or at least for the time being. Our allies are compromised and weakened, and what has emerged is that that little nut in Iran has become emboldened on the world stage, and it is due to us that Iran is today emergent as a power in the region. we created not only the vacuum for Iran, but we created the resentment off which Iran preys. Ahmadinejad, to explain for a minute, is a little bit like Farrakhan in the sense that I had a friend who headed the African American Studies program at Howard University and worked with me on the Jackson campaign, one of the smartest analysts I know of black American politics. And he once said, Farrakhan, we were working together in the Jackson campaign trying to deal with the phenomena of every time we'd make some headway, Farrakhan would stick his head into something and draw all the press away from Jackson. And he said, God, I wish they'd shut up, meaning the opponents of Farrakhan who kept trying to beat on him and make Jesse distance themselves from him. He said, don't they understand that Farrakhan is the term he used, the measure of the depth of black alienation from white America. And because they're angry, and justifiably angry, he knows it. And he knows how to provoke whites. And when he provokes them and they strike back at him, it only makes them stronger. Because it fuels the resentment that exists, and people say, you know, he's right, damn it. And that's what's going on with Ahmadinejad right now. He knows that he can prey off of the resentment and fear and anger and the sense of loss of control. And here you've got this little bit dictator who is in fact emerging as the guy who reasserts control and defiance against the West. How sad is it that his numbers are higher than ours? Or Karen Hughes, I had lunch with her the other day, and I'm not saying that to throw a name around, but just to tell you it was a funny coincidence because she wanted to talk to me about public diplomacy work that she's doing. And the day she had lunch with me, there was an article, she'd written an op-ed in a newspaper, and had the weird headline, Bin Laden is losing, which I guess is nice. From her perspective, it'd be better if she could write we're winning, but she was writing he's losing. And evidence for it was a poll in Turkey where his unfavorable rating was down 90%. That's a good thing. But as I reminded her at lunch, because we do polling and so I know the numbers, I said, but you know, our unfavorable rating in Turkey is also 90%. The difference is that his favorable rating is 9 and ours is 7. So he's actually 2 points higher than us, which is not actually something you want to write home about, that Bin Laden beats us by 2 in Turkey, which is a NATO ally of ours. And so the problem is that we're in this hole. It's a hole made by bad policy. It's a hole made by bad policy because we do not understand the realities of that region, and we just are digging it deeper. And the problem is that in the debate, there is no recognition of that. And the person who's going to lead us for the next 4 years has got to do better than we've done in the past. Because the hole is so deep that if we don't begin to get out, we only get in deeper. And what troubles me is that there have been opportunities to get out. The Iraq Study Group, which was actually, I call it the widest sold, least read book in America at the time. It was almost like, I don't know, some of you are too young to remember Rushdie's book, The Satanic Verses. Same thing. Everybody owned one, but nobody read it because you couldn't read it. It was basically an unreadable book. But the Iraq Study Group book was very readable. It was short, and the print was big. And it actually had an outline. You could just go through the outline and read it, but nobody read it. And I remember in Washington at the time of the election, 2006, and what now? Democrats, you're now controlling Congress. What are you going to do? Well, we're waiting for the Iraq Study Group report to come out. And Republicans, well, what are you going to do now that you've lost? Well, we're going to wait for the Iraq Study Group report to come. Everybody was waiting. It was like waiting for Godot. But the difference was that it actually came out. And it came out sooner than everybody expected. And as soon as it came out, it was like, okay, now we go back to whatever. And so it didn't tell Democrats exactly what they wanted, didn't tell Republicans everything they wanted, and so they ignored it. But it was a bipartisan consensus document. And it actually made some sense. Because what it said was we got to get out. But we have to get out responsibly. And we have to take time to do some things in order to get out. And the things that we had to do weren't a surge, which meant going in deeper. What it said was, we have to build a regional compact of the surrounding nations. and engage them in a sort of permanent enterprise, not unlike what we did in Eastern Europe when we created the ISCE. A framework where the competing parties work out problems on an ongoing, standing basis. Now, I remember when we first started talking about that 3 years ago, people would say to me, but you want to let Iran in? I said, well, they're already in. And Syria is already in, and Turkey is already in, and Saudi Arabia is already in. You know these Anbar tribes that are turning against Al-Qaeda? It's got nothing to do with us. The Saudis are buying them off, and it's smart that they're doing it. They've got interests in Iraq. They do not want Al-Qaeda to win. They do not want Iran to win. And because we were screwing it up so badly, the Saudis took it into their own hands and began to buy the tribes up and try to win them away from Al-Qaeda and away from Iran so that they'd have some ability to protect themselves. And the evil Iranians, and I have no love for what that regime has done in Iran. But what are they doing? They're protecting their interests. It's a country on their border that threatens them. So they're going to be involved. And the Turks are waiting and massing troops on the border because it threatens them too. They're not evil in this instance. Well, they ought to treat the Kurds better, and they treat the Kurds abominably. But they have interests. And the Syrians do too. You know, it's funny. I mean, we want to threaten. And when somebody says something, we say, fight fair. You know? I mean, duh. Everybody in that region has an interest, and we're in it. We have evidence of Iranian involvement in Iraq. The Iranians come out with a really dramatic study that says we have evidence of American involvement in Iraq. I mean, the point is that we're all in it. And so the solution is not to ignore that, but to recognize it and institutionalize it and bring everybody up, sitting around a table saying we got to work it out because none of us can afford to get this out of control. That's what the Iraq Study Group said. And it said one of the things we got to do to get there is to not just make an effort to solve the Israeli-Palestinian issue, which is sort of the throwaway thing, which is what Rice is doing right now, go and have a meeting and not doing anything, but we have to solve it. Because one of the ways we establish our bona fides in the region is to help people see we can make a difference in their lives by actually doing something that solves a problem. And on and on and on. But what did we do when it came out? They threw George Bush a rope because he's in the hole so deep that he cut the rope. And even now in our policy debate on both sides, the right and the left do not allow reasoned debate. I'll give you one example of Barack Obama. On one hand, Obama said, we ought to talk to our adversaries. Whoa. Right wing pounced on him right away. He wants to talk to the evil dictator. Well, and so that snuffed that out. And then he came back, Obama said that instead of just leaving, he said we ought not to be as careless in leaving as we were in going in, which is kind of like the Iraq Study Group thing. And then the left pounced on him for being irresponsible. You want to leave troops behind? Well, no, that's not what he said. But the lack of tolerance for any reasoned discourse. I mean, I can't imagine a presidential candidate being able to come before you and saying, let's understand the history of the Iraqi people before we go forward. But I would say to you that if I want your vote, which I don't because I'm not running, I ought to respect you enough to tell you what I'm going to do with your lives and your futures. And not talk to you in slogans and cliches. And I would hope that you would respect candidates who would do the same with you. And one of the things that has to be done is you started here in Iowa. By saying to them, okay, I understand what the cliche is, sir, and the bumper sticker, I got that one down now. But exactly tell me, what will you do to bring peace between Israelis and Palestinians? How will you deal with the needs of Israelis for security and the needs of Palestinians for self-determination, and they too need security? What will you do differently to make it work than they've done in the past? Tell me that. And if he starts to get restless or she starts to get restless and nervous and they don't want to answer the question, tell them, you know what? You want to sit in the White House for the next 4 years. I need an answer. I want to know how you're going to do it. I don't think that's being aggressive or hostile or mean or anything. I think it's being smart. Because you get to ask the questions that they don't want to have asked, but that we need answers to so we can make an intelligent decision. What are you going to do in Iraq? And don't tell me I'm going to take all the troops out, every single one, by the end of the year. We got embassy people there. What are you going to do with them? We got 70,000 Iraqis who supported America in Iraq. They supported us. They worked with us. They were translators. They were employees. We're going to leave them all to die? What are you going to do with the 400,000 Christians who are still at... There are 1.5 million internally displaced people in Iraq right now. 2.2 million refugees out of the country right now. We're doing nothing for them. Nothing to help them. You got other candidates saying, well, I'm going to partition the country. I mean, that shows as much ignorance of Iraq as it did when we went in the first place. I do a TV show, weekly television show. Basil mentioned that when I did. One of the things we do in the show is we do dialogues with students here and students in the Middle East. And we did one dialogue with students in Iraq right before the war started. We did another one a month into the war, and we did another one just back in May on the 4th anniversary of the last show. And we used some of the same students. It was fascinating. We got them back and we wanted to talk about where are we now? What are we thinking now? And one of the things that shocked my students was they were going on about the Sunnis and the Shiites and the whatever, back and forth, because we've learned a couple words now, and so we want to throw them around a little bit. And they were going on about that, and one of the Iraqi kids raised his hand and he said, my mother's Shia and my father's Sunni. And I said, okay, how many of you, of the Iraqis, are in a similar situation? Parents are from each different sects. About half the kids raised their hands. How many of you live in neighborhoods that are mixed? All the hands went up. It is not possible to partition. And to say that what you're saying is that you are condemning millions of more people to displacement and death. I've been saying this for years. I remember back when this thing started out, people would say to me, "You're supporting Saddam Hussein." I said, "I opposed Saddam Hussein when we were supporting him." I mean, I remember going to the Democratic Convention in 1988 when we took the Palestinian plank. We wanted an arms embargo on Iraq and Iran, and the same people in the Democratic Party who didn't want me to do a resolution on Palestine didn't want that because we were supporting Iraq. Both parties were supporting Saddam at that time. The stuff was passing through Congress right and left. When Don Regal, senator from Michigan, did the hearing in 1992 after the war on weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, he produced a book. I have it sitting on my desk. Never took it off my desk from then. About all of the weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological ingredients that Saddam had that all came from American companies. We knew he had it because we sold it to him back when he was our ally in the 1980s. And when we supported him, the people suffered. And when he went into Kuwait and we got him out, the people suffered. And when we imposed sanctions, he didn't suffer, the people suffered. And we went in to depose the dictator, and the people are still suffering. We have never paid attention to the people of Iraq, of their needs, and we will pay dearly for it, as they will, in the generation to come. Because the next generation of people who hate us are being born right now in the streets of Baghdad. There is always a blowback for bad behavior. They get it, and we get it too. Ask them what they're going to do it differently. Ask them what they're going to do to pay attention to the needs of other people so that we can be respected in the world again. Ask them what they'll do to solve the Israeli-Palestinian issue and what they'll do to bring Lebanon together. And I think it can be done. I think it can be done. And I've seen actually in glimpses in the last three administrations. Now don't laugh, because all three of them had good points. If you go back to George Bush and Jim Baker, I mean, there's plenty that I disagree with both of them about. Plenty. But they knew how to do diplomacy. And they knew how to use pressure. And they knew how to make pressure and diplomacy work to achieve certain objectives. The problem was that the objectives they set were too small. The goals were too limited. It was get out of Kuwait and then leave it all alone. It was get the Soviets out of Afghanistan and then we abandon Afghanistan to the fates, which is why the Taliban came in the first place. It was get all the parties to the Madrid Peace Conference, and then once they were there, victory. And then we went to 11 rounds of negotiations that produced nothing because they were absent from the scene. And then you got Bill Clinton, who represented something quite different. Kind of understanding and a passion to learn more. I went to brief him one time, and they asked me to come in and brief him on something that was going on in Israel and Palestine. And I went in to brief him, and he said, no, that's not it. And then he went on to tell me what it was, and it was like, whoa. He knew way more than any of his briefers did because he was a student and thoughtful. But what Bill Clinton's failure was the absence of using pressure. He never used it. He never used the power of the presidency as he could. I saw him use it in little ways, and I marveled. I went with him on a trip one time we went to Jerusalem, a state dinner with Benjamin Netanyahu, and then we went to Gaza, where we did a dinner with Arafat and spoke to the whole Palestinian National Council. And Netanyahu tried to put him down at the dinner because he said, tomorrow you're going to Gaza. You called it the land of the Palestinians, Mr. President, but I'll tell you, he said, David and Solomon walked on that sacred land. And when you go to Bethlehem the next day, that was the home of David. These are our lands. Clinton got up and said, you quoted your Bible. Let me tell you about mine. He said, my Jesus says that unless we can forgive those who have injured us, we will never be forgiven for those who we have injured. And he said, we all have a lot of atoning to do, and we all have a lot of recognition of the rights of other people. Everyone has their scripture. Everyone has their story. We need to be respectful and forgiving. And he sat down. I was in an audience of largely Israelis. They cheered our president because they knew he was right. Then he went to Gaza the next day. And in Gaza, we were all telling him, don't do this, Mr. President. I mean, they've already renounced their charter. Don't make them do it again. He said, I need them to do it. I need them to do it. And so he got up in front of 700 people. Many of them had come only for that meeting from outside. And he gave a speech that was overwhelming in terms of its impact on people. He said, I know your history. And I know you've been dispersed and dismembered as a nation. And I want you to be free in your own land. But I need you to do something for me. I need you to one more time renounce that charter that denies the rights of other people to self-determination in this land as well. Would you do that for me? And they stood up. Some were crying. Men I knew from the PLO days who were hardened revolutionaries, tears in their eyes, and they stood up and cheered for the President of the United States. He could use it. When he used it, it worked, but he didn't use it enough. And the result was, at the end of his term, he offered a plan, but it was too late because he did not have, at that point, the political power and capital to use the pressure to make it happen. And then you get George Bush, who actually had the right vision of two states. First president to say it, and it was the right thing to do. Had the right vision of democracies in the Middle East. But the absence of pressure and the absence of understanding and the passion to learn, ultimately we end up with visions becoming idle fantasies that cannot be realized. I believe you can put them all together. I believe you can have a president who has the right vision. I believe you can have a president who uses pressure effectively. I believe you can have a president who wants to learn and know about the issues that he's becoming involved in or she's becoming involved in. And the simple fact is that if you put together that package, you actually can make a difference. My sense is that it will not start with them. Candidates are not by nature intellectually curious beings. They're people with an eye on one thing alone, getting votes and winning. That's their job. I mean, you don't ask the cleanup hitter to learn how to steal bases, and you don't ask the outfielder to know how to, pitch to a batter who's got a 3-2 count. But when you're running for a campaign, you have a limited objective, and that is to focus on only what you need to focus on. I'm afraid that if we go through a campaign without tough questions being asked, without answers being demanded, and they win too easily, they will not have the curiosity after they win to deal with the issues that they haven't been confronted on during the race. So I ask you to ask them the tough questions. I ask you to demand of them how they will do it differently than we've done it before. Put it to them, we're in a hole. How are you going to get us out? How are you going to make a difference to clean up this mess that we're living with right now that has not made us more safe and more secure, but has made us more vulnerable than we've ever been before? One of the simple approaches I could recommend to you is a group that's been formed, and I see Jeff with the shirt on right here. There's a group called Concerned Iowans for Middle East Peace, and they're working real hard across the state to mobilize thousands of caucus goers who will, just on one little issue alone, say to the candidates, will you, as president, move to get Israeli-Palestinian peace achieved that creates security for Israel and security and a contiguous state for the Palestinians? Will you commit yourself to doing that? And if you will, I'll vote for the candidates who do that. I won't caucus for the candidates who don't. It's simple. It ought not to be rocket science, but there are candidates who won't do it. And what Jimmy Carter, who was the one who actually first enunciated that pledge, said was that if you want it to be different, you've got to challenge it to be different. Because in this case, smart policy is going to come from smart politics. It's going to be people organizing and creating the movement that demands change that will force the candidates to change in turn. You are more than ethanol in this state. You are bigger and more important than that because you represent all of us. You get to do what none of us can do, and I urge you to take advantage of the opportunity that the rest of us look to you to take advantage of and do. And that is help us. Help us not only pick the right candidate, but help us pick the candidates who will actually make a difference to save our lives and our children's lives and restore the honor of our country overseas. Thank you very much. Now, Valerie over here and Jeff over there and Emily over there are passing around this little thing that has the petition on it. We've already gotten 1,000 people or so. Actually, before I take questions, and I do want to take questions because I want to have a chance to have you comment or criticize or question me. I want to do that with you. But I also want to ask if any of you want to help collect more of those. I know that Emily, who's doing this, would really like the assistance. I mean, I'd like to say, do you have any friends? But I'm afraid that I'd embarrass some of you who wouldn't be able to raise your hands. But because I don't know what I'd say either. I think I have friends. No, but if you have people, friends or family that you can go to get the sign, I'd really like you to take an extra form and get them filled out, because I know they're working real hard across the state to get this done, and they need more and more people to make this happen. So Valerie, just circle your name or put an X next to your name, and she's got extra brochures that will help you figure this out. And now, just if you want to come talk to her, please do. Sign it, and while you're doing that, I'll take any questions you've got. Thank you again. Yes, sir.
I've been going here for a while. I graduated in December. In the last 3 years, we've had a parade of very intellectual, very intelligent speakers come and talk to us about Iraq. And they all paint a very bleak picture. And I was wondering if there was any solution that's been suggested, or if there isn't, what solution you might suggest that would bring about a better end than things like the three-state solution or the very light answers that the primary candidates have given us.
Yes, I can take you back to the Iraq Study Group report, which clearly at this point needs to be updated. And there is a push in Congress to update it. But I know that there's also resistance from Secretary Baker and Congressman Hamilton, who are saying, we're willing to go through the effort to do it, but will it be listened to? They actually thought they were helping to solve a problem, and it got ignored. And I know that they're embittered by that experience. But clearly, wise minds can come up with, I believe, a reasoned approach to help us find a way out. And even within the basic framework of what the Iraq Study Group, dated though it may be at this point, called for, you see the beginnings of a solution that makes sense. We will not be able to put the country back together again anytime soon. But we will be able to create internal stability in the country. Understand one thing, that Iraq, when it was created, like Lebanon when it was created, because it was pieced together of competing groups that had never been together before, what occurred was that a sense of internal politics shaped by external forces. And so almost by necessity, the Shia community gravitates one way, and the Sunni tribes gravitate another way, and the Kurdish and the Turkoman and other peoples in the country gravitate in other directions. But over the period of time, a nation-state emerged. I mean, there's a real phenomena today called Iraq. And there has been an integration in the urbanization of Baghdad that is huge as a city, incidentally. That's the heart of that country. A mingling of peoples and building of institutions that you can't replace anytime soon. And so the notion of dividing it simply makes no sense. But the notion of trying to put it together does make sense only if you bring in those surrounding countries and make them part of the regional security arrangement and invest them in the solution. Because frankly, as much as each of them are involved in it right now, the last thing any one of them want is an unraveling of the country. Because the biggest problem in Iraq is not the internal civil war that we're caught in the middle of right now. The biggest problem is if it spills over into regional conflict. And it very well may in the next year. If the Kurds continue to push south into Kirkuk, which they very well may even this winter, when there is a referendum that they want to have on the fate of Kirkuk. And if they do, and move too aggressively in that direction, you will see the Turks becoming involved. And that is something you do not want to have happen. Because we won't be caught in the middle of a civil war, we'll be caught in the middle of a regional conflict. And if the Turks get involved, you can bet damn sure the Iranians are going to get involved. And the Saudis are not going to let Iran get involved without becoming involved themselves. And it would be wholly hell to pay if a mini world war begins to develop with 150,000 American troops caught in the middle of it. So you either invest them in it, or you pay the price of having them find ways of carving out their spheres of influence on their own. And so there is an approach that you can use. But frankly, the approach that you have to use is one that requires, I think, something like the study group and the various components that they recommend. Not perfect, and there are plenty of places to pick on it. But when they gave it to the public and to the president, what they said was, don't cherry pick with this. We worked real hard to come up with a consensus document. It not only helped to try to find a way to create a new context in Iraq, but to create a bipartisan Democratic-Republican consensus. And if it had been listened to, we'd be a long way on the road to getting out, but doing it responsibly, not as carelessly as we went in. Okay? Thank you. Anything else? Yeah? You have a what? Okay. Holy Land. It ought not to have negative connotations. And I mean, the fact is, we got to get over it. Israelis got to get over the fact that Palestinians exist and are an independent people, a people who have a right to self-determination. And Arabs got to get over the fact that Israel is not going away, and it's a people that have the right to, at this point, to a nation of their own and self-determination within the borders of the 67. The borders that were there in 1967, and to the degree to which either side sees the other has a negative connotation is indicative of the fact that they're not yet ready to recognize the reality of the other and the right of the other to justice and self-determination. And both peoples are deserving of it. Let me just finish with him. I'm sorry, and then you, ma'am. But I don't think it's going to, look, I get asked this question about the one state versus the two states. There really is, if we were to give up on there being two states, the price that would be paid in the long term, in terms of the numbers who would die and the suffering that would occur between now and then, yeah, but that's not going to happen. I mean, the Jewish people are not going to, at this point, surrender their right to self-determination as a people and subordinate themselves to majority rule. They're not going to do it. That's been the issue in Palestine from the beginning. The Arabs wanted one man, one vote. In the 1930s and 40s, that's what they called for. And in the 50s and 60s and 70s, they said one man, one vote. And the Israeli Jewish community said one man, one vote means ultimately that we're a minority. They're not going to accept it. And similarly, the Palestinians, to say to them, bide your time under occupation for the next generation until there's a point where you can have a Mandela South Africa solution, I cannot in my heart or conscience accept Palestinians having to endure that strife, the burden of occupation for another generation. It is devastating. What it is doing to this generation of Palestinians is just unbelievable. And I frankly think that we do not know enough here of what people are dealing with there on a daily basis in terms of the health conditions that they endure, the loss of hope that they endure, the psychological burden that they endure, the humiliation that they endure. Honestly, if it were happening to any other people and were being done to them by any other people, there'd be an uproar. But there's not. It's Arabs, and it's being done by Israel, and they get a pass on it.
And also, in South Africa, what was the catalyst to move against apartheid that made it actually happen?
It was the black community here was a very powerful factor in creating an anti-apartheid movement that was really significant. We were talking before. I forget your name, Mary. She worked for Congressman Merv Dimely in the House of Representatives, who was a friend of mine. And when we did the debate on Palestinian rights in '88, Merv was the seconder of my motion. But back in 1988, this is 1988. 1988, one of the Jackson planks was an anti-apartheid plank. We had to fight like hell to get it included. And at one point, the Dukakis people said, okay, we'll give you South Africa. And pardon my French, but Eleanor Holmes Norton, the congresswoman today from Washington, she said, don't fuck with me about South Africa. You're not giving me anything. And nobody had ever heard her talk that way before. But the fact is that African Americans, as late as 1988, couldn't get it into the party platform. So it was not easy. Even on that one, wasn't easy. They didn't want to confront the apartheid regime. And it took sit-ins at the embassy, and it took a mass movement that emerged. You finally got Congress to do the sanctions bill. And it was the sanctions bill that ultimately worked, because divestment from South Africa meant that whites started looking around at their government and saying, this is not sustainable. This is just not sustainable. And so they were the ones who ultimately deposed the regime. It was rather bloodless at the end of the day. Everybody signed it? Who didn't sign it? Don't tell me that. Who signed it? Anybody willing to help collect? Yes? Good. You got to get 100 by tomorrow. No. You had a question, ma'am? Mm-hmm.
And so he couldn't do it. To your mind, who could do it? I mean, obviously,
It wasn't that Bill Clinton didn't do it. It couldn't do it. It's that he didn't do it. Look, I was really close to those guys, and I worked with Vice President Gore. The plan that he put on the table in December, they had in its outline form 6 months earlier. Before Camp David, he should have submitted that plan. He could have sold that plan, and we could be home free by now, and Barak would have won re-election. But what he did was, he made a fundamental mistake, because he listened to advisors who told him, don't come forward with your plan, let Barak do his plan. And Barak, frankly, who was an arrogant little twit, came in, made demands, said, this is it, take it or leave it, wouldn't talk to Arafat. Arafat got insulted, didn't talk to him, and everybody went home mad. And we were sort of frustrated, and we had promised Arafat, because Arafat said, I don't want to come unless there's an agreement. We shouldn't have a summit that builds expectations unless we know what we're going to get. And Clinton said, no, I need you to be there. And Arafat believed that Clinton would submit his plan, but he didn't. And so when Arafat got there, he said to Clinton, if I leave here, will you blame me? I cannot endure what these people are doing. Clinton said, no, I won't. But then Clinton turned around and blamed him, which was the wrong thing to do. Now, the issue here is that what Clinton finally submitted in December, Palestinians and Israelis continued to negotiate at Taba and got even closer. It could have happened, but the president had to step in earlier and give them, they couldn't do it in 3 weeks. They needed months to do it. But by not doing his plan until the end, he lost the opportunity to do it. That's what I mean. He had the passion and the understanding, but he failed to use diplomacy when he should have, and he failed to use pressure when he could have. And that would have made the difference.
Okay, so then to your mind, who is the closest candidate do you think that could do it?
I'm not going to do that. I've picked a candidate. I have picked a candidate. I'm not going to lie to you. And I'll be back in a month or two to campaign for my candidate. But I'm not here today to campaign for my candidate. And it would be in violation of the sacred trust with Iowa State. Sorry, anybody? Yes, ma'am? I don't always like those.
If George W. Bush asked you tomorrow to help build his presidential library so that he has a room for his legacy, and there's a room called Middle East Peace Initiative, what would you put in it?
I'd put the Clinton plan. I'd put the Clinton plan, and I would put the Baker pressure, and I'd put the Bush vision. I mean, just what I said to you. The vision's right, but the pressure was missing, and the passion and understanding of Clinton was missing. And so Clinton, what his plan was a very thoughtful exercise in all of the contours, and he showed, he didn't just say, we need two states side by side, which is what Bush did. He actually talked about the contours of the states, about the various details that would go into it. It was a very wonderful document. And by the time the Israelis and Palestinians finished mutually agreeing in Taba, they got even further. And even after, in Geneva, Israelis and Palestinians, many of whom had been at Taba, continued the talks as an exercise and produced the Geneva Agreements, which is a marvelous document. Actually, I'd put the Geneva Agreements that Yossi Beilin and Yasser Abu-Rabbo and people like that actually put together. And you know what's really interesting? I love this stuff about, people who like to talk about the Jewish vote and about the Arab this and the that, whatever. We poll. And we poll Arab and Jewish public opinion in America. And so working together with some of the Jewish groups that we are allies of or who are allies with, I don't want to dangle the preposition, my mom would not be happy with me, who are our allies, we have polled with Peace Now and the Israel Policy Forum, Arab and Jewish opinion. The first time we did it, we took the Geneva Agreements, each piece of it, and we said, are you in favor of this? Strongly agree to strongly disagree. And we took each one of the parts of it. And you know what we found? And it's all on my website. We found that within the margin of error of each other, Arab Americans and Jewish Americans agreed on the contours of peace across the board. They were stunned. We all held our breath till the results came in. We were stunned. I couldn't believe. I mean, you could look at the Jewish numbers and say, wow, look at the Arab American opinion. You look at the Arab American opinion on support for Israel and opposition to terrorism and condemning the identical views. There is a constituency to win if you don't play the politics of convenience. And those who say, well, you're the Jewish community, I call them the anti-Semites for Israel. They don't care what the Jewish community really believes. They're not talking to it. I do more synagogue appearances than they do. And I know that Jewish Americans want the same thing for their people that I want for my people, which is an end to all this. And so the fact is that it's there. They agreed to it at Geneva. Clinton put it on the table. But absent presidential pressure and absent the vision and the commitment to make it happen, it just becomes, I said, the vision becomes an idle fantasy and actually a cruel joke that you end up playing on people. Because you dangle the carrot in front of them, but you never let it get close enough for them to have it. And I am afraid, I'll tell you right now, the biggest thing I'm afraid of is November and this peace conference, which they now say is a peace meeting. And it's actually just a discussion. Because expectations are so high that let down one more time, those who will pay the price will not be this time the Israelis and Palestinians. They're already paying the price as much as you can pay. It's going to be the Jordanians and the Egyptians, those who are our allies who've supported this, who are putting their last chips on George Bush making this happen, and they're going to get let down. And there will be a price to pay at home for them as they get humiliated in the eyes of their own people. This president's playing with fire everywhere in the Middle East, and it is to the detriment not only of us and our future, but also of our allies and friends in that area. Yes, sir?
Is there a nonpartisan resource that people can go to research and compare opinions on foreign policy, such as you're talking about, between the presidential candidates?
Well, let me tell you, this is a bit of a plug for my institute. What we do is we actually put up on our website, it'll be up next week, we actually have two people in my office who do nothing but catalog everything that they say about all the issues of the Middle East. And it'll be up next week. And it'll not only have sort of their crystallized position, but all their background positions too. You actually find a lot of it on their websites, but you have to hunt and peck. We've actually made it a one-stop shop. And if they say something in a debate someplace and it's not on their website, we put it up anyway. And what we've done is, because it's the concerns that we focus on, we have a section on Iraq and a section on Palestine and Israel and a section on Lebanon and a section on broader relations with the Arab world and a section on civil liberties and a section on immigration and other issues of concern to us. And so I think it's going to be we've done it in every election to date. Since there was an internet. I'm old enough to have had an organization before there was an internet. And it will be up again, and it'll be up next week. Okay? And both parties. We do both parties. Yeah. aaiusa.org. And if you want to email aaiusa, one word, .org. And if you want to email me, and ask me a question that you don't get to ask tonight, I don't mind ever doing that. In fact, I will respond. It's jzogby@aaiusa.org. Okay? Two more questions? You, and you, and you. I'm getting all three. Sorry. Yes. Pardon? Yeah, you know, that's actually the huge question of the moment. And I have long believed in the rights of the Kurdish people to self-determination. They, like the Palestinians, are the victims, the major victims of World War I and the aftermath, which carved up their homeland into pieces. The problem is that you cannot solve the Kurdish question in one country. You can, however, protect the rights of Kurds in Iraq. And you have to. They cannot be subjected again to the abuse that they were. But I think that it is hypocritical of us to be protecting them in Iraq and not protecting them in Turkey and not protecting them in Iran or in Syria, where the problems exist everywhere, mostly in Turkey, where the situation has been abominable, the treatment of the Kurdish people. And so my sense is that at some point, either the countries in which the Kurds live will have to grant them full citizenship, equal rights, and and the protection as a community, or this demand for severance, of separation, is going to continue to be there. Now, on paper, the Iraqi thing is working right now. I mean, the president of the country